Yeah, well,
You know,
thanks for coming. Thanks for coming. What are you going to tell us about today, then?
can governments tell the truth, or is it possible for a government to govern truthfully? I would argue probably not. Okay, let's imagine a case where a government rules truthfully, right? It'd be more like something like a monarchy or, a warlord, right? We are the government, right? You do what we say or we kill your family, right? That is a very honest form of rulership, right? We've got all the guns, you do what we say or we fucking kill you. Now, most people would not be happy living under that kind of system, but that is at least honest, right? If you go to the government and you're like, why should I do what you tell me? The government's like, well, if you don't, we're going to kill you and your entire family, right? It's honest. Now, the problem is that the societies that we live in today are based around that premise, right? But no one likes to put it that way, right? Now, I'm not saying that a modern Western democracy is the same as living under an African warlord, right? The problem with living under an African warlord is that, it's only really the warlord's decision. He is, the rule. Like, if he wakes up one morning, he's had like a bad night and he decides he needs to like kill, 1,000 people from the opposing tribe, well, it's done. At least in a modern democracy, you have institutions that make decisions. But the implied threat of force is behind everything the government does, right? That's why ultimately people do what the government tell them to do. It's because if they don't, the government will use force upon them. Now, people don't like to admit this fact because in modern societies, we've sort of abstracted it a bit, right? It's like, the government doesn't directly use force against you, and because the person who makes the decision is generally not the same person who will use the force against you, right? Like, the government passes a law, that's one person, that gets filtered through the civil service, which is like a bunch of other people, and then the cop that actually comes to arrest you is another person entirely, right? And so in this space of institutions is supposed to make it so that there is as little personal animosity between the person getting like nicked for the law and the person who passed the law. So you don't have a situation where, you have a rule that's like, it is now against the law for this guy to date my stepmother. Right? You know what I mean, right? Like that's where the person passing the law and the person enforcing the law, they're all basically like the same thing, and that's very inefficient, right? But the question is whether governments can survive on telling the truth. Well, let's imagine that they did, for example. Okay, so you ask the government, for example, why do we have to go to war in Ukraine, for example? And they say, well, there's a whole lot of money tied up in it. Sort of the Americans really want us to do it. They're leaning on us like very, very heavily. We're sort of all up in this sort of Western liberal democracy thing. It's NATO. It's all of these kinds of like things. This actually runs into a deeper question about whether government can itself honestly articulate what it is doing, right? But I mean, that's another question. You can't just go to the people and just tell them the honest truth in a democracy, right? This is one of the big problems with democracy. You get voted in based upon saying comforting stuff to people and generally giving people stuff, right? It's not supposed to work that way, but that's how it works, functionally speaking, right? Vote for me. I'm a really nice guy. I'm going to tell you all the stuff that you want to hear, right? Like, we'll have equality and prosperity, and I'm against all the things that you don't like, and I'm for all the things that you like. And if you vote for me, more of the things that you like will happen, and right. So, and then of course you have the sort of subcolory of that, which is vote for me, I'll give you a bunch of stuff, right? Again, they don't sort of tend to say it in quite those words, but vote for me and, we'll cut your taxes, or you'll get more money this way, or, So the first problem is that when you vote somebody in, right, they're not in government for a start, right? So they don't have access to the information, right? So you must be aware of that like old trope, right? Where like, you get like a young up and coming politician and he's like, I'm gonna change the world, ma, right? And he goes out, he's a really honest guy, and he gets, like, voted in, right? And he's like, oh, yes, finally, I'm the president. Things are going to change around here, right? And then he gets into the fucking Oval Office, and, like, 3 men in, like, grey suits with, like, briefcases come in and be like, Mr. President, it's time that we tell you what the fuck's actually going on, you know what I mean, right? And then you see him the next day, and he's got a few more fucking grey hairs, and he's, like, looking like, oh, my fucking God, how about, you know, because...
Like that Bill Hicks bit where you see the JFK assassination from an angle you've never seen it before.
That's right.
The blood is splattering on the camera. Hang on a minute. What's going on here?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Now, I mean, whether this sort of event takes place as some kind of, like, actual, like, just mafioso thing, where, you know, they rock up and they're like, hey, that's a great election you had there. You got a very promising career in front of you. Be a shame if anything happened to it. It's a very nice family you have. Your wife and your kids are very healthy, aren't they? Yes. We want to make sure it stays that way, right? I mean,
yeah.
Or, I mean, in a lot of Western democracies, you often don't even have to resort to, actual violence in order to control politicians, right? You know, given that reputation is what it is, if you've got enough dirt on various politicians, you can just basically make them do what you want. I mean, this is one of the things that people don't understand about the sort of the conspiracy theory way of looking at government politics, which, you know, you're not supposed to, like, do anymore.
Oh,
okay?
God. Heaven forfend that we ever think that people try to accumulate wealth and power.
Oh, yeah, and behind the scenes, and have, like, you know, secret interests that they don't reveal to the public.
Oh, are you suggesting that they meet in rooms and they sit on leather-bound sofas and potentially smoke a cigar while they discuss these things?
I am suggesting something even worse, right?
They don't skydive while they do
There
it,
are
please.
certain, you know, groups based on interest or religion or class or ethnicity, right, that have, like, long-term plans, right? And given that the way democracy works is you change leaders every goddamn 4 years, right? So no one ever has, like, a long-term plan. These people have long-term plans and that they work to further their own interests. I know. Who ever heard of such an absurd thing, right? Mm-hmm. Everybody knows that every single group in the world works exactly like a democratic government, right? They have a plan that only lasts for 4 years. And once, like, that 4 years is up, they abandon that plan and they go to the opposite thing. That's how that works, right? I mean, you know, look at groups like the Freemasons, for example. They're famous for, like, changing their entire philosophy every 4 years. No, they're not. These are groups of people united by some kind of common interest or bond, right? And I'm not just picking on the Freemasons, right? I'm not like, oh my God, the Freemasons are the only people who do this. There are tons of interest groups, ethnic groups, class groups, who have these long-term plans. The socialists, you know, people at Fabian Society would be another good example, right? And they operate on these long-term plans, right, behind the scenes, and this essentially becomes the problem, right? The other problem with the government ruling honestly, right, is that there is a tendency to scare the living shit out of the people if you're honest, number one. Okay, so you get into power, the 3 dudes in the grey suits like come in and they say, oh yeah, so Mr. President, the country's broke. We're worse than broke. We are like trillions and trillions in debt, and the only thing that's stopping our country from defaulting is the fact that everyone doesn't know that we're out of money. Right? Now this is like a real thing, right? This happens all the time. It's one of the reasons why central banks operate the way that they do. Because if the central bank comes out and says, oh, we're fucked, right? The market value of their currency and bonds and everything is going to, just fall through the floor. And, the interest rate and everything will spike and it will just make a bad problem worse. It's one of those, like, weird sort of situations where the perception of a thing is much more important than the actuality of the thing. And there's a lot of stuff like that in politics. Okay, so let me give you another example. Say you are ruling over a town with like a very, very high sort of divided ethnic population, right? And you know that there have been a bunch of like assaults or rapes or, attacks from one group on another group, right? But you know that if you are public about this, right, then you might incite an inter-ethnic war in your city, right? And nobody wants that. Well, I mean, this is the other thing about government, is your first rule is supposed to keep things stable. Like that's literally government exists basically to keep the lights on, keep the food going, and provide security. And security is about stability. So anything that happens that would be likely to undermine stability, right, government doesn't want to push. Now, there seems to have been a bit of a reverse course on this recently, right, with things like COVID and with the climate bullshit, right? They're like sort of deliberately amping up hysteria in the population. But you got to understand that these are not things that anyone can do anything about, right? You can't go out and like punch coronavirus in the face, right? You can't go out and like punch climate change in the face. These are abstract concepts, right? And a lot of ruling has a lot to do with mobilizing people's feelings about abstract concepts, whether it's the capitalists or, you know, the Jews or, you know, the whites or the immigrants or, you know what I mean, right? Like, these, you know, climate change, you know, like you induce fear in people. But imagine if the government was going around doing the kind of messaging about climate change that it was, like, say, against, I don't know, the Muslims, for example, right? You know, so the government comes out tomorrow and was like, you know, our world is in danger, you know, and the reason is the Muslims, right? Well, they would never do that, right? Like, because that would probably result in a whole bunch of people upping and attacking the Muslims because they're like an actual group. This is one of the reasons why critical race theory, for example, is such a bad idea, because it's a general principle of government that you don't, especially in a multi-ethnic society, you don't demonize one group of that society, because the end result is always eventually violence, because all the other groups like pick up and they're like, well, you know, why do you be keeping us down with that systemic racism? We best go and show him what for, you know what I mean? And I think that's also why government is so incredibly worried about the grooming gangs thing, right? Because obviously they do not want a bunch of the English attacking the Pakistanis in revenge, and then the Pakistanis attacking the English in revenge, and before you know it, boom, you've got like a, you know, inter-ethnic conflict going on in a small city. So I would say that there are very few things in government you can be truthful about, really, right? Like, even stuff like, you know, we want you to do the thing because is liable to be like messed with, right? Because from the government's point of view, well, we need people to do the thing, right? So they don't think, oh, well, what's the most truthful way to convey information about the thing? No, no, no. They think, what is the messaging that would get the most number of people to do the thing, right? You saw this very, very clearly about a certain medical procedure, which you're not allowed to talk about on YouTube, right?
Mm-hmm.
Although the evidence for this medical procedure was scant, right? And although it didn't do some of the things that they claimed it to do, it was very, very clear that the government's goal was to get as many people to accept this procedure as possible, right? And thus they backwarded and thought of the best messaging to do that, right? So truth really has very little to do with it, right? I don't know whether government has always been this way, whether it comes and goes. I feel like the English in particular used to be more honest with their populace, right? Like, I mean, never perfectly, obviously, because even if you were perfectly honest with your populace, how many of the people would even be able to understand what the fuck you're saying, right? You know, politics is a specialized vocation, right? It's, there's a lot of things in politics that sound really, really bad, you know, like the classic conundrum if you're a government, right? If you kill 100,000 people to save 1 million people, would you do it? Right? Now, from the government's point of view, generally speaking, the answer is yes, right? But that also has very, very weird consequences ultimately. You know, which 100,000 people, you know, like...
Who decides?
Who decides? Exactly. Well, the government decides. That's what being a ruler really means, right? There's an old saying, sovereign is he who decides the exception, right? What this means is that real power is when you get to determine how and when to break the rules. Okay, right? So you've got like a bunch of rules, you've got like a bunch of laws. And then a situation comes along that doesn't really cover that. Or, you know, you've got to make a split-second decision, or you've got to go outside the law. If you have the ability to do that, you are the sovereign. You are the man. You are the, the one who decides the exception. Right? Like human rights matter. Except you, Mr. Assange. We're fucking, we're fucking you up. So politics is a specialized vocation. Foreign policy, especially, is a specialized vocation.
Well, they make these things very specialized by denying the population in education, in politics, economics, philosophy, religion, all the things, more things that are in psychology, all the things that would amount to in education in the
that is undoubtedly true, right? But some people are also very stupid.
Yes,
right?
Yes.
And in the UK, for example, we are losing 1 point of IQ every 10 years. Okay, so that might not sound like a lot, but in aggregate, it is quite a lot, right? The difference between, like, say, 110 and 105 in the broad population is quite a bit.
Why are we losing this 1 point of IQ? Is it the television rotting our brains, chemicals in the food? Again, all coming from the same source?
I'm not really sure. It was, I think it was Ed Dutton who was talking about this, the Jolly Heretic. It could be a lot of things. It could be immigration. We're not, for example, IQ testing people that we let into the country because that would be racist for some reason, right? Mm. But the government could do that. They could say, look, you can emigrate to this country as long as you have an IQ over X. But, the tests are racist. They're not. They're really, really not. How can a test that is primarily composed of, like, matching geometric patterns be in any way racist? A lot of IQ tests, they don't even use fucking English, for Christ's sake, right? Like...
Did you ever take an IQ test?
Yeah.
I can't remember what I got in mine. We did a maths one on the television when I was a student, and everybody did it, but I'm pretty sure that I decided the IQ test was very limited because it was too based upon maths, and I didn't like it. How did you feel? How did you score?
I scored really well.
Surprise.
Yeah, but there's the one I did was at Mensa, and the two kinds that you do is one is like a literary comprehension thing like words, which I aced because
I never got that one.
Motor mouth, right?
Yeah.
And the second one is pattern matching and geometric stuff. And I didn't do as well at that. I don't think there was even a math component, to be honest. Maybe there was. It's been a while.
That maths one in the year 2000 was very much, there's a train going to this place and it's carrying this much load and blah blah blah. My dad was a maths teacher, but I'm useless at it. I didn't feel like my emotional intelligence was being measured by this nationwide test, Chris, and that's why I did badly.
Well, I mean, this is the thing. People always are like that with IQ tests, right? If they do well, they're like, oh yes, this test is brilliant. It measures very well, and they do badly. And and this has been the argument by like people against IQ tests. And sure, they're not perfect, but we don't have anything else better, And whether it's immigration or whether it's lifestyle or whether it's, it could be like a bunch of stuff. The fact that we're losing 1 point of IQ every 10 years is very, very important because the stupider you are, the less able you are to understand complex arguments, right? And given that politics is full of those, right, I would argue that the stupider the population gets, the more the government has to lie, just to survive, right? Because, look at Extinction Rebellion. Right? This is classic example, right? You tell most of these people, oh, look, we need natural gas to make fertilizer and shit like that. To be fair, the government's not even fucking trying to say that. I really wish they would just turn around and be like, look, we can't net zero. But, that's a whole other subject. I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that a lot of governments all over the world have been essentially co-opted by globalist interests. Because they all do the same thing, and they all do it at exactly the same time. Back before the globalists, right, if you're old enough to remember, Western governments used to do different stuff, right? They'd sometimes, be in conflict. One country would do, one thing, and another country would do another thing, and it'd be a little... Now, they all just, particularly on, climate, they all do exactly the same thing at exactly the same time. There's never... And any ruler... Any leader who gets voted in that looks like they're going to go against that, well, they get very, very swiftly removed. Look at Liz Truss. 44 days she was in office, right? No one really knows why she was, fired, right? Did the men in the grey suits come along and say, look, Liz, here's the deal. You can either, get the fuck out and live off £110,000 a year, adjusted for inflation for the rest of your life, or we're going to make stuff really, really ugly for you. You know what I mean, right? If we don't have dirt on you, we're going to get dirt on you. You know, we won't just hassle you, we'll hassle your family, we'll hassle your kids, we'll hassle, like, everyone you know, we'll go over your entire life with a fine-tooth comb. You know, there was a inquisitor called Cardinal Richelieu in France, in, like, I forget the century, 15th, I think. He had this saying, right, that was like, give me any 3 letters from a man and I can damn him, right? And, you know, because people used to write, like, long letters to each other, you know, back in... And Richelieu was basically making the point that if you get enough written text from, like, any one person, right, you can always find something to fuck them over with if you're, like, coming from an ideological position. So, like, Richelieu was a Catholic inquisitor, if I remember correctly. So, from his point of view, he would be like, oh, you know, we're going to search your letters for, I don't know, heretical thought or some shit. You know, you can always find something. The problem is when you have a population that accepts that premise, right? That heresy is a reason for people to be excluded. We're seeing this, like, very, very clearly at the moment, right? Particularly with the unnamed medical intervention. The number of people who are just... It wasn't about whether the thing worked or not. It was about whether you believed it worked or not, right? And also about whether you were willing to sacrifice for, like, the good of the country. Which is a weird thing, actually, right? Because that would seem to indicate that from a very early point on, people knew that it was hurting them. Right? Why do you... If it's completely benign and it makes you feel great, why is it a sacrifice?
Nobody said that they're doing it for their health, either. It was always to gain some access to a plane or a party.
Exactly.
Oh.
No one was like, oh, you know, I'm doing this for me, it makes me feel great.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody knew that it was making them feel crap. It was seen as, like, this duty that you had to go through for the country. The amount of, like, wartime messaging was, like, really quite creepy. You know, if you've ever studied, like, World War I or World War II propaganda, it's very, very same kind of stuff. You know, do it for the country, you know, all this kind of, like, stuff. And this is another problem.
And they told the doctors to push that to their patients, the war rhetoric, in memos. Mm-hmm. I've interviewed a nurse who quit his job who was complaining about that very thing, but you were about to say, sir.
So this is another problem, right? Say a war, you have a war, okay? You need to mobilize as many people to join the army as possible, okay, right? And the way that you do that is to paint the other side as, like, evil villains who are literally the font of, like, all evil. The way you do it these days is to call them Nazis. And I mean, it's so freaking weird that both sides in the Russia-Ukraine/West war are doing this, right? The Russians are saying the Ukrainians are Nazis, right? And the West is saying that Putin is a Nazi. You know, he's Putler, right? Because that is the way sort of the modern religion operates. Do you know what I mean, right? Like, the worst thing in the world that has ever existed is the Nazis and Hitler. Therefore, anything you associate to that becomes very, very bad by association. And you have all these people being like, oh, we must defeat Hitler, you know, or Trump, or whoever the fuck it is, you know, on any given day, right? Yeah. But this is the point. If a government in wartime cannot mobilize enough people to get a large enough army to defend its country, it won't exist. So, again, you don't mobilize people for an army by saying, oh, well, you know, the Germans, they're kind of, like, okay, but I'm, like, in a bit of a beef with my, like, cousin, and, you know, he fucked my sister, and, you know, it's a bit of a family spat, or conversely, you know, they took a bunch of our gold, or conversely, you know, this is a matter of honor, right, between, like, you know, the ruler. There are, like, tons of wars that, you know, or we have to do it because of our treaty. That sounds much, much less convincing than we have to go to war to preserve democracy and fight, you know, Hitler and, you know, and preserve freedom. And you can tell because these are always very airy concepts, right? The way you mobilize people is through high-sounding words that basically don't mean fucking anything, okay? So, like, democracy is a great example, okay?
Yes.
the amount of government decisions, right, that actually correspond with the expressed wish of the ruled people is statistically insignificant.
Oh yeah.
Right? No. Like, they've literally done papers on this.
Yeah,
and they
yeah.
have found that
Princeton's got a
the
famous one.
correlation between these two things are statistically insignificant. Right? In other words, what you want as a population has literally no bearing on what the government's actually going to do.
That's what I always
right?
say to people. Like, you can go through every institution of the land and you can say, well, do they do the opposite of what they say they do? Is prison about rehabilitation or is it criminal college? Does the NHS really make people better when anesthesiologists kill half of the people who die in hospitals before 2020? And of course the opioid crisis and blah, blah, blah. We can go through every institution of the land, I think, and it can be proven that it does the opposite of what we want it to do and what they say it does.
Well, I'm
to a
not
large
sure.
extent.
I'm not sure about that, right? I mean, like, take something like the NHS, okay? Like, it is a massive institution, okay? And it works on, like, formula. It's, like, very, very rigid sort of bureaucracy, right? And bureaucracies always kill people, right? It's just, the real question is, does the NHS save more lives than it kills, right? And does it do so in a cost-effective manner? This is the other thing, right, that governments can't tell the truth about, which is that every human being has a price, has a value, right? And at the end of the day, someone has to sit down and run the numbers, right? And from the point of view of the government, in monetary terms, you are worth exactly as much money as you produce in taxes over your entire life. That is your monetary worth. Right? But you're not going to get elected saying that. Right? You will get elected saying, oh, every man and woman is like a special, like, so, and look, I'm sure some politicians actually really even believe that, right? But you can't run a government on those kind of ideas, unfortunately. It's just unworkable, because sooner or later, right, you're in a situation where you could save 10 people if you killed one person, right? If you take the deontological sort of Kantian position that every soul is equally worth and like sacred, and thus you can't kill anyone to save anyone else, well, you're screwed. More people wind up dying. So